Ever think about, like, living in a whole city, like, designed and built, and even maybe, like, governed by one single billionaire?
Oh, wow.
Sounds kind of wild, right? Like, ripped from a sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
But it's not just, like, a crazy idea anymore.
Right.
We're seeing some heavy hitters,
Yeah.
people like Elon Musk and Mark Lohr, Bill Gates. They're actually putting some serious money and effort into creating these brand new cities from scratch.
What's interesting to me is that it's not like just one weird idea, floating around out there. You have all these big names with completely different backgrounds and obviously tons of money, all exploring the same concept, which, makes you think there's like a bigger shift happening here in how we think about, building cities and stuff.
Totally. And that's the core of what we want to dig into today.
Yeah.
Are these billionaire-funded cities like the next big thing in how we live, offering innovative solutions to like the classic urban problems? Or are they like just the ultimate vanity project?
Yeah.
A billionaire's utopian fantasy with like the super high price tag.
Right.
We've been going through a bunch of articles and reports on these initiatives, and our goal in this deep dive is to give you the rundown of what's going on, look at it from all sides,
Yeah.
and hopefully help you make up your own mind about what it all means.
Exactly.
So, to kick things off,
Yeah.
let's look at this. I guess we're calling it the billionaire city boom.
Yeah, and it's worth like just wrapping your head around the scale of what they're trying to do here.
Right.
I mean, this isn't just some normal real estate project. These are like meant to be full-blown self-sustaining cities.
Yeah.
Which takes like a crazy level of planning and like buckets of money. I mean, it's almost unheard of in like modern times.
Yeah, and let's start with Mark Lohr's Tolosa project.
Okay.
Just the numbers alone are mind-blowing. Like, we're talking a proposed $400 billion investment to build a city for 5 million people.
Wow.
And the principles behind it, from what we've read, are sustainability, clean energy, and this really interesting concept of equality.
Oh, interesting.
Now, when you hear equality and billionaire-funded project in the same sentence, it definitely raises some eyebrows.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Even the sources we looked at were asking, like, can a billionaire really create a city of equality?
That's the question, right? Like right off the bat, what does equality actually look like in this context? Does it mean, equal opportunity or like equal access to resources?
Yeah.
Or is it something totally different? And how do you actually build that and keep it going in a city that, at least at the start, owes everything to one dude?
Right.
So it brings up some fundamental questions about power, right? And who's really in control.
Absolutely. And then you have Elon Musk doing his thing down in Texas. He's been quietly buying up land. And the word on the street is he wants to build this private city specifically for like his Tesla and SpaceX employees.
Oh.
So picture this, a place where you work, you live, you probably shop, all within this Musk-controlled environment. And one of the big questions that our sources ask is like, straight up, is this like a brilliant idea or just modern day feudalism? It makes you think about, how much freedom people would actually have in a setup like that.
That comparison to feudalism, is really interesting. And I think it highlights like some of the big concerns about too much power in one place.
Yeah.
Like historically, feudal systems were all about, super strict hierarchy and very little freedom to move up or change your situation. You were pretty much stuck where you were born. So the question is, even with the best intentions, could we end up with something similar when so much of people's lives is tied to a single employer who also owns, all the land?
Yeah, it's a pretty intense comparison. Finally, we have Bill Gates' Smart City project up in Arizona.
Right.
He went and bought a massive chunk of land, 24,000 acres, with this vision of creating a super high-tech city center.
Interesting.
The focus is all on like making it a smart city packed with all the latest technology.
Right.
So we're talking AI managing traffic, self-driving cars everywhere, and homes that are like totally integrated with all these smart systems.
Wow.
But one thing that our sources brought up, and it's a good question, is like, will people actually want to live in a city that's so driven by technology?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if maybe we're losing sight of some basic human needs.
Right.
In the rush to make everything super efficient and techy.
I think, the idea of like optimizing life through technology sounds cool and all, but like, what are we giving up for that?
Yeah.
Like, what about, just running into people or, building those community connections that just kind of happen naturally?
Yeah.
What about just stumbling on something new and interesting when you're not even looking for it?
Right, right.
In a world where everything is so controlled and managed by algorithms, like, do we lose some of that?
Yeah.
And then there's the data, right? Like, what kind of information would they be collecting and who would actually control it?
Yeah, big questions there.
Definitely things for you, the listener, to like really think about.
For sure.
Yeah.
As you can see, this isn't just some like billionaire side hustle.
Yeah.
These are serious projects that could totally change how we live in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But as our sources point out, there's this like real tension.
Yeah.
Are these big leaps forward making cities better, or like one source put it, are billionaires just playing SimCity in real life?
Right, right.
So to help us figure that out, let's dive into the potential pluses and minuses.
Right. It's important to go beyond the hype and like actually break down the possible advantages and disadvantages that could come from these, privately developed cities.
Okay.
So why don't we start with the potential good stuff?
Okay, so let's look at the pros, or as one article called it, why this could actually be genius.
Okay.
First up, you have the potential for real innovation and smart infrastructure. The big advantage these projects have is that they're starting with a clean slate.
Right.
They don't have to deal with all the old, outdated infrastructure that many existing cities are stuck with.
Yeah.
This means they can build in the latest technology right from the start. Imagine an AI system that manages traffic in real time so there's no more congestion.
Right.
Or a totally integrated clean energy grid that's super efficient and sustainable from the ground up.
What I find fascinating about this clean slate idea is that it allows for systemic innovation. Instead of just trying to slightly improve existing systems, they can actually implement, say, a completely circular economy model for waste management right from day one.
Oh, interesting.
Or they could design public transport networks that are, totally autonomous and adjust on the fly based on how many people need to get around.
Wow.
So the potential to create truly integrated and optimized city systems is huge.
That's a great point. Another plus that's often mentioned is tackling the housing crisis.
Right.
Projects like Tolosa specifically talk about offering affordable housing options. And if they can actually pull that off on a big scale, that would be a game changer, especially with, how crazy expensive it is to live in so many cities these days.
If you consider the sheer size of some of these projects,
right,
the potential to create a whole bunch of new housing units is definitely there.
Yeah.
The big questions, though, are, what does affordable actually mean in this context?
Right.
And what kind of mechanisms will they have in place to make sure that it stays affordable in the long run and that these cities don't just become, playgrounds for the rich?
Exactly. Good point. And lastly, the massive undertaking of building entire cities from scratch could mean tons of new jobs and a big boost for the economy.
Right.
I mean, from the initial construction and infrastructure to, running these cities once they're up and running, there's the potential for a huge amount of job creation and investment, which could have, positive ripple effects across the economy.
The idea of creating entirely new economic centers is definitely intriguing. These projects could attract new industries, boost innovation, and create a demand for all sorts of skills and professions.
Right.
But, it's crucial to look at the kinds of jobs that are created, right? Are they jobs that offer long-term stability and opportunities for people to, move up and build a career?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are some pretty compelling arguments on the pro side.
Definitely.
But now we got to flip the coin and look at the potential downsides, the cons.
Right.
Or as one article dramatically called it, why this could be a disaster.
Okay.
One of the biggest concerns is about governance.
Yeah.
Who's really calling the shots in a city that's owned and mostly controlled by one billionaire or some private company? What kind of voice would residents have in the decisions that affect their lives, every day?
Right.
There's a real worry that these cities could become corporate-controlled societies where profits come before the needs and wants of the people who live there.
Yeah, but this is a core issue, right? In established democracies, citizens have all sorts of ways to participate in their local government and hold them accountable.
Right.
Through voting, town halls, things like that. But in these privately owned cities, we don't really know how that would work.
Right.
What kind of governance structures will they have? Will they like include any democratic principles or like actually listen to what the residents want?
Right.
That's a big unknown, and it's definitely something to be concerned about.
Definitely. And this brings us to the idea of like Company Town 2.0.
Okay.
Back in the day, we had these company towns where the employer owned everything, the housing, the stores.
Yeah.
They even paid people in, like company money sometimes.
Right.
And people had very little independence, and there was a real risk of exploitation.
Yeah.
So the question is, what happens if someone living in one of these billionaire cities disagrees with the owner, right?
Right.
Could that mess with their housing, their job, their access to basic services?
Yeah, the history of like company towns is a good reminder that too much power in one place can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. When people have no other options for things like, work, where they live, or even where they shop, it creates this like dependence on the company, or in this case, the billionaire, that's not healthy.
Right.
It limits their freedom to make choices and speak their minds. So in these self-contained city ecosystems, it really raises the question of like who actually holds the power and how is that power being used?
For sure. And then there's the very real possibility that these projects could just fail.
Right.
Ambitious, futuristic city projects don't exactly have the best track record.
No.
We've seen plenty of grand plans that never really took off.
Right.
Or, they start out strong and then fall apart, like some of those early utopian communities in California.
Right.
So what would happen to all the people who, like, uprooted their lives to move to one of these billionaire-backed cities if the whole thing goes belly up? Could they end up like stranded in a failed experiment?
That's a crucial point to think about.
Yeah.
Building a city is like incredibly complex, right?
Right.
There's so many things that can go wrong. Even if you have a ton of money, these projects aren't immune to like economic downturns or some new technology coming along that changes everything.
Right.
Or just people losing interest and deciding to move away.
Yeah.
So the risk of like massive social and economic disruption if one of these projects fails is very real.
Yeah, so the idea of a billionaire-built city might sound kind of cool at first, but there are some serious potential downsides to think about.
Definitely.
And to figure out whether these visions are actually realistic, it's helpful to look at what's happened in the past when people have tried similar things.
Right. By studying historical examples and like real-world attempts to create these, planned communities or company-dominated towns, we can learn a lot about the potential challenges and like the unintended consequences that can pop up with these new ventures.
Exactly. So let's take a look at the Facebook housing crisis.
Okay.
Facebook decided to, try and help out its employees by building housing for them near their headquarters in Silicon Valley.
Right.
Now, that might sound like a pretty sweet deal, right?
Yeah.
But what happened was that employees started to feel like trapped.
Oh, interesting.
Because their housing and their job were so closely linked to Facebook, it gave them this sense of like limited options. And they felt like they couldn't leave the company, even if they wanted to, because it would mean losing their home too.
Yeah, I think this example shows that even something that seems like a good thing can have these unintended consequences, right?
Right.
It's all about autonomy, and like even when things seem beneficial, they can create these dependencies. When so many parts of your life are tied to one company or one entity,
Right.
it can really impact like your sense of freedom and your ability to make choices for yourself.
Absolutely. Then there's the story of Celebration, Florida, which is this town that Disney developed.
Oh, yeah.
On paper, it was supposed to be like this perfect utopian community.
Oh, right.
But the reality turned out to be a bit different, right?
Yeah.
Residents complained about high costs of living, problems with how the town was managed.
Right.
And in the end, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, which, kind of goes against the whole utopian ideal.
Right.
So it shows that even with like tons of planning and money, creating this like perfect company-run town is really tough.
Yeah. Celebration Florida is like a classic case study, right?
Yeah.
It shows that even with like a big name like Disney, a ton of money, and a clear vision, building a successful community that people actually want to live in is about way more than just the physical buildings and like making it look pretty.
Yeah.
The social aspects, the economic side of things, and how the town is governed.
Yeah.
Those are all super important too.
Yeah.
And they can create all sorts of challenges that you might not expect.
Yeah. So if we look back at history, I think the big takeaway is that even with good intentions and tons of money,
Yeah.
These highly controlled urban environments don't always work out the way people planned.
Right.
And that brings us back to you, the listener. After hearing about these ambitious plans and like the potential pitfalls, what are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, based on these past experiences and the pros and cons we've talked about, what jumps out at you as the most important factor in whether these billionaire cities succeed or fail? What are your personal priorities when it comes to like where you'd want to live?
Yeah, those are the big questions we're left with. So would you be willing to pack up and move to a city that's built and, largely run by a billionaire?
Right.
Do you see this as like the next step in how we plan cities? A way to like skip over the problems of existing cities and create these like super efficient, sustainable places to live?
Right.
Or do you think it's a risky gamble, potentially problematic?
Yeah.
And ultimately driven by the like massive wealth and personal vision of just a handful of people?
I think it really comes down to weighing the potential for innovation and, creating these efficient systems against the risks of giving so much power to one person and potentially limiting like people's individual freedom. It's not an easy decision. And, your perspective will depend on what you value and what's important to you.
Absolutely. We really want to hear what you guys think about all this.
Yeah.
Head over to the comments, send us a DM, and let us know your take on the billionaire city boom.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, whether these ambitious projects, actually work out in the long run and how they impact society, it all depends on a bunch of things.
Yeah.
How well they're planned, how adaptable their governance structure is, and like, most importantly, the experiences of the people who actually live in these cities.
Yeah, that's key. So on that note, here's a final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
Think about the fundamental push and pull between having centralized control versus giving people individual freedom when it comes to designing and living in cities. How might the specific values and motivations of one powerful person or, a corporation shape the whole feel of a city and the lives of the people who live there?
Right.
In ways that could be totally different from cities that have developed in a more like distributed and democratic way.
Yeah.
It's a question that goes way beyond these specific projects and gets to the heart of how we want to live together as a society.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you later.